Hey everyone, quick little announcement here from Fishing the DMV. Our club membership on Patreon is nearly full. There are only five membership spots still available. Once these spots are gone, they're gone. And I'll be closing down the club membership to new members until 2026. At that point, you can try to sign up, but it'll be at a higher rate. All Patreon members will receive 5% off their orders to Jake's Bait and Tackle, 10% off their orders to Tiger Crankbaits, 10% off their orders to Catoctin Creek Rods. You'll also gain access to our private Facebook group community. You'll also be allowed to enter our 5 club membership tournaments only with guarantee payouts, members only content, ad-free, commercial-free episodes of the podcast, Patreon supporter giveaways, and so much more. And you get all of this for $6 a month, which is less than a pack of Cincos or a jackhammer chatterbait. And since we're under our 10 membership spot, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to give everyone a 10% off their membership if they sign up for the year. So that brings it down to under $65 a year, locked in indefinitely as long as you want to be a member. Hurry up because there's only so many spots left before I shut down the club to any new members until 2026.
You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your host, Thomas Ahrens. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked up, I don't know what will.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Fishing the DMV. I'm your host, Thomas Ahrens.
I'm Jared Mounts with Jake's Bait and Tackle.
So we got a tag team today, don't we?
Yeah, so you guys have seen John Odenkirk before with the state on a previous podcast, and Jeff Kelble as well. And Jeff, for our viewers and listeners, you've had quite an extensive background in fisheries on the river, starting off as a guide, and then I think when I first met you, you were a Shenandoah Riverkeeper, which at that time I had no clue what a Riverkeeper was or what they did. And then you went on to Potomac Riverkeeper and actually did a lot of work in D.C., Washington, D.C., legislation and different things, and then now you're kind of coming full circle with Ashby Gap Adventures, and you're a local guy. And so one thing we wanted to try to do in this segment is, I think a lot of times we all enjoy fishing. We've all grown up fishing and enjoy the fishery. We don't often think about that fishery as a resource, and it's a live resource in the ecosystem as a whole. And I think we have a responsibility as anglers to make sure that resource is healthy for not just our generation, but also future generations. So we'll kind of get into that today. Before we do, Jeff, kind of just tell us a little bit about yourself and that experience that I mentioned.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. I'm 50 years old. I started in the industry in 1999. Started rowing boats in Harper's Ferry, working a little bit for Mark Kovach Fishing Services. The guys up there that were part of the Potomac River Smallmouth Club asked me to come out and guide. I was the president of the Potomac River Smallmouth Club at the time. So I was 99, I think 2000. It was after I did all the other, membership, newsletter, all the other things there. And then finally they gave me the presidency, which was a lot of work. Great club. I mean, at the time, the club was thriving. The fisheries were crushing. We'd gotten out of the 96 floods. We had massive reproduction in 97. Those fish grew to 12 inches in their first year. And we had an amazing fishery. We ended up having a really big fish fishery that I moved my guide service into. So I had really good timing. Made me look like I was a really good guide. So I guided probably in the superstar years of the river. Got fairly good at finding big fish, which as you guys have covered before, and the game department talks about the memorable fish concept. And for sure, my theory as a guide was, if a guy either catches or loses a fish, I wasn't sure which was better for the business, but if they saw a giant fish, made a huge impression on them, they would want to come back. So I spent a lot of my time, I spent time with Chuck Raft, who's probably the best fishing guide this planet has ever seen, who passed away a couple years ago, and gave it a pretty good shot. And then we lost a fishery. First, we lost the North Fork in 2004 to a series of fish kills that lasted about 2 months, and virtually nobody observed it. It was April and May. You generally start to fish that river in May, late May and June when they can wade it. And there were rumors, and I was guiding it, and I saw some mortality, and And I'm getting into this because this is kind of how I got into conservation.
Mm-hmm.
I was taken there. Mm-hmm. I didn't set out to get into conservation.
Okay.
I set out to be a fishing guide,
mm-hmm.
and I kept going to the North Fork even while the fish were dying. And I told my clients I wanted to take them, but I didn't want them to pay me. I just needed to see what was happening. Game department was loosely aware of it as well. It wasn't until 2005 when the South Fork got pulled in. Chuck Kraft, who I've mentioned, called me around April 9th. He said, "Kelble, are you out there?" I said, "I've just got back from the New River. I haven't been out." He said, "We have dead fish in every eddy, all over the place on the upper South Fork." And he said, "Watch the lower South Fork." And I was running trips, basically Luray down to.
What year was this again?
2005.
2005, and specifically on the north. What section of that?
On
what area? North Fork, originally.
I ran the Strasburg area.
Strasburg.
Well,
okay.
I had 3 floats.
Gotcha.
So and if you want to make a living as a fishing guide, which is not an easy thing to do,
right.
you need to have a lot of stretches of river because rivers are going up and down all the time.
Right.
So you have to kind of cherry pick. So I had a stretch in the way upper North Fork, in the center of the North Fork, and the lower
Gotcha.
North Fork,
Okay.
upper South Fork, 2 in the lower South Fork, main stem, and Potomac. And so with that combination, I even made it through the 2003 year, which before 2018 was the wettest year we'd seen on record. I made it through and only canceled 1 trip in the season. So my season was between 150 and 175 trips a year, which is about all you can do March to through November. And then December, January is sporadic. You can get trips, but if you're a rafting guide, which I was in a jet boat guide, it's not the primary season. So I literally watched the fish kill on the North Fork, on the South Fork in 2005 develop. And in that year, our fish went on beds on April 14th. I know you guys have covered the spawn. It was early. We had 60 degrees. We had a fairly significant warming trend. That is the earliest I've seen them on beds with eggs. I've seen them sweep beds as early as mid-March when the water hits, if they've moved, when the water hits 60 degrees on an upward trend, males will sweep. But there's no females with gravid eggs. They're not ready to lay. And so April 14th is about as early as we'll get at this latitude. We won't see it any earlier than that. And they were on beds. They had eggs. They're fertilized eggs. They were tending. And then about 3rd, 4th day in, they started turning black. They literally looked like they were jet black, like charcoal, color of their young. And they were stopped having like a flight or fright. So I look at this bass and it was kind of sulking around in its spawning area, not really tending its eggs, carefully. I'd move my boat in to look, and they wouldn't swim off, and they were just sort of lost their fear. And so that was the beginning of it. And it developed, and not every fish, and not all of a sudden. It took about 6 weeks. We lost what I estimated was somewhere between 5 and 10% of the fish each week. And by the end of it, it depended on where you were. In the upper South Fork, we had about 95% mortality of the smallmouth.
Wow.
We had about 100% mortality of rock bass, somewhere around 90% of mortality of the sunfish. And when we get down into the main stem, it was closer between 50 and 70%, depending on where you were. Potomac had some impact, but it wasn't as significant. And I think the game department estimated like they averaged about an 80% fish kill. And most fish kills are related to a spill or an anoxic environment, crash of algae, right? Algae blooms, algae dies, so the decay of the algae pulls all the oxygen out of the water. Occasionally you have mortality associated with like a really heavy turnover in the fall. It's none of that.
So for those that don't know too, so like, and this is why this is good too, because we don't, like anglers, we're floating, like we're kind of seeing it too, or you're not getting the same catch rates, and it's kind of like what has happened, and so what's happening behind the scenes that we don't know about, like, so when you get this phone call, and then even with the state, like, is there collaboration that's happening, amongst these mines to get on the water and start doing testing, and how does that work?
It ended up being what I mentioned to John earlier was probably the largest collaboration the area has ever seen, maybe has ever occurred in the United States.
Really?
We had, and Steve Reeser was asked to form the Fish Kill Task Force. Steve was out of the Verona office.
Currently my boss.
Currently your boss?
Yeah.
Oh, Steve's one of my favorite people.
He's a good dude.
Yeah. And not an easy job. You assembled industry, because industry needed to be represented, and that meant large manufacturing facilities, the agricultural interests, housing, citizens groups. because I was documenting it, and I literally took out a pen and paper and I documented what I saw for about a month. Because there was nobody else out there. I thought, this is going to happen, and no one's going to know what happened. I guess I got to write it down. My memory's not good enough. I've been hitting that too many times. So I wrote down, took really copious notes, what I saw, catch rates, observations of fish mortality. And then I was able to bring those observations. So I think the contributions that I made were that I knew the fishery, I knew the fish, I knew the ecology of the fish. I'd been watching them since, at that time, for a decade, really closely. Felt like I understood them pretty intimately, from wintering into pre-spawn reproduction to summer, how they move into wintering water again, their movements up and down the river, fish population dynamics, things like that. I paid very close attention to it because I had oars in my hands every day for 10 hours. I just got the look. I wasn't fishing. Fishing a lot of times makes you not see stuff. But anyway, the fish kill task force assembled, and it looked like no other fish kill that anybody could remember or knew of. And that attracted some amazing scientists. So scientists are curious people. They like to solve problems. They like unique challenges. And so we had some of the top fishery scientists, ecological scientists in the United States, which probably means the world, were attracted to the task force. And it was, so I continued to guide in 2005, but I had to change. I moved, believe it or not. I wanted to keep my clients together. I had 5 days booked for the whole season. And generally I was done booking usually by about March. And so I had to go somewhere. I wanted to take my fishermen somewhere. So a lot of them, the fly fishermen, all learned how to catch carp on fly. We learned it together. And then the guys that didn't want to do that, I took them to the Rappahannock, basically. In that fishery, I got some private landowners to agree to let me use some of the stretches. So I used the stretches between Remington and the confluence, and I was able to make a living doing that. And but back to the task force. It was assembled early in 2005, and then I was approached in the fall of 2005. I had a daughter on the way. I had just opened a bed and breakfast in the Shenandoah that I made for 2 years. We moved out here to establish a guide service and build a B&B. And then the fishery collapsed. My wife and I talked about whether we need to move, go to the James, go to the Susquehanna, or change our plans altogether. And that's when Ed Merrifield, who was the Potomac Riverkeeper at the time, called me. I'd been working with him on some things related to Potomac Riverkeeper. I was his river watcher on a number of stretches of river for about 5 years. And he said, I have 4 foundations that want to put money into a pool to hire a person full-time to work on the issues in the Shenandoah. Are you in the position to do that? And then eventually I agreed to it. And so I came to it by invitation, and didn't set out to be a conservationist. I really knew nothing about it. I was pretty excited to be on the task force because I just wanted to get in there and figure it out. I wanted to be with the scientists and the game department. And I wanted to, we all had wild ideas about what was causing the fish kills. And, everybody said this or that, which we don't have to get into today.
Did you have any biology experience, any schooling or anything? You seem very knowledgeable about it. Was that something that was learned?
I was a pre-med student, so I took organic chemistry and physical chemistry and biology, various levels things. But I had no formal training in this other than just looking in the river for hours a day, daydreaming.
It's worth a lot.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, there's probably nobody that knows how fish spawn better than I do. Smallmouth spawn better than I do right now. And I think the Tro brothers down Mossy Creek know what they're doing. For sure. Chuck taught me a lot, and I took it from there. But back in 2005, when we were working with the U.S. Geological Survey, I took Vicky Blazer down the river, and we identified every nest in the most prolific stretch of reproductory water in the South Fork and Shenandoah. And we took one of the super high-end GPS systems. She wanted to see if there was a relation to geology, where certain fish died, certain fish didn't, depositions of toxic sediments. We looked at everything.
Wow.
We vacuumed eggs off of nests. We looked at the chemical compounds that were in the embryo's yolk sac to see what they were consuming when they were going through sexual reproduction and sexual development. And Vicky learned that almost 100% of our fish were intersex. Almost all the males were producing eggs or immature eggs in their testicles. That was discovered originally on the South Branch Potomac, and then they had a light case. The Shenandoah had the big case. So Shenandoah had almost 100% intersex in its males. Now they weren't laying eggs, and the eggs didn't mature, but they were producing them.
Is that too shallow of a gene pool, or is it actually like a chemical imbalance that through generations created that type of out?
She believes it's exposure to estrogen mimics while they're going through sexual differentiation. When an egg emerges, it's this tiny little, looks like a sesame seed, but it's black, charcoal black, and has an egg sac. And for depends on water temp, 2 to 4 days, it's just consuming its yolk sac. And that is actually the period when it differentiates into a male or female. Is while it's consuming that yolk sac. And so one of the theories to feminization of the males was that it was exposure to estrogen mimics while they were sexually differentiating. And so anyway, we're getting into some real detail, but this is the kind of depth that this task force went into to look at every potential theory. And when we sat down, the first meeting that Steve conducted, everybody in the room, shared potential theories, and we looked at them. And there were 13. And so we broke the task force out into 13 groups, and everybody went home to try to research something that would be a preliminary study that might support the theory. And 13 people came back with evidence that said that the theory could be the cause of the fish kills.
Wow. So 13 different theories.
13 different theories, almost all pollution related.
And let me say too, real quick. So don't underestimate what you guys are doing, because I think we had anglers come in here, and I can remember after a particular tournament on the river, low catch rates, and not even filling a 5 fish limit, right? And which was predominantly a good fishery, and they're just losing their mind. I mean, they are cussing. They're basically saying, look, we can land on Mars and bring back rocks, and we can do all this stuff, but we can't determine what's wrong with the fishery.
Right.
And so that's how we can be sometimes as anglers. But to your point, it's not, you guys are getting paid. You're getting paid. You guys are really deep diving into this to try to figure out what is the source, what is the thing. And see, that's what I'm saying too. We don't realize that. People they're out there fishing, they don't realize the amount of time and energy is spent and work is spent, the number of minds that are being put together to try to figure this thing out.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I think it really comes down to just a lack of communication. I mean, like, generally speaking, it usually is that, a lack of communication. When we talk about, like the Maryland, and how they have talked about the Potomac River and stuff, the biggest gap there is no one's getting in front of the narrative and communicating what it is. And in prior episodes, guys, we've talked about the Department of Virginia Wildlife Resources. Their website and their email list is banging. They're giving out information, they're keeping people up to date. So for better or worse, it's harder for rumors to start when there's information that's out there in the public. And I remember growing up the Shenandoah River, there wasn't a lot of information that even as a kid I could be aware of. You had to really dig for it, and so rumors start, and then the rumors snowball and snowball, and that's where it goes.
And this was the part of the issue, is that the game department is here to manage. Now it's the department. I'm sorry, I cannot get VDGIF out of my head. I never will figure out how to say DWR.
Yeah.
But there, as we said, they're a wildlife resource management agency.
My shirt says DGIF.
Attaboy. Yeah.
Slow to change.
They're going to deduct pay if they see you in that thing, aren't they?
Can't waste the uniform.
Where was that going? So,
but where you were at, there was 13 different.
So the game department, in many ways, was sort of handcuffed, right?
We're not even responsible legally for investigating fish kills.
That's right.
Which seems counterintuitive to a lot of our constituents. They don't get that.
Yeah, the Department of Environmental Quality.
Don Kane, who you work with a lot.
That's right.
The DEQ is the legal authority in the state, so we're subservient to them whenever a fish kill happens. They rely on our expertise quite a bit. Because there aren't a lot of people at DEQ that know a lot about fish.
So Steve Reister's counterpart was Don Kane, who is a terrific man as well. And the two of them worked, hand in hand because of this relationship. Don is retired.
So that's a good point, John. That's something else you don't realize. That's not in your responsibility purview to do that. You're going to be able to give them good information and intel, but that's not your
and I have theories about that too. There were a lot of agencies, both federally and at state level, that managed fisheries and also dealt with pollution, and they were generally during the Reagan administration they were separated in that era. specifically.
Okay.
Not as a commentary about Reagan, because I think Reagan was a great president, but I don't love that was done. And it was also when a lot of the scientists were taken out of the U.S. fisheries and broken off into U.S. Geological Survey and other agencies. So
if you get a massive fish kill like that, is that still a state issue, or does it become federal? Like, how does that work, and when does it go up the chain of command? Is it always a state if there's a if it was pollution, let's just say randomly, is it still always going to be a state issue, or did it ever like get superseded to federal?
It will never not be a state issue because it's a state issue. And the game department would always be involved, and DEQ would always be involved because the federal government has delegated authority to Virginia to regulate pollution and manage fish. And so specifically, so there's, the US EPA is the federal agency that oversees the Department of Environmental Quality, but only when, and then they review permits. They have to finally approve permits, but they've delegated authority down to the state level. That's specifically a methodology of that the U.S. Clean Water Act of 1972 created.
Okay, interesting.
Where the federal government set a pollution floor. They said no waterways can be dirtier than this. They set up a method to test them and determine which ones are impaired, and they put them on an impaired list. And then the agencies it's incumbent upon the state agencies to create a regulatory system to return those waters back to what are called water quality standards that make it fishable, swimmable, and drinkable. Those are the three standards, and it's federal law, but the authority is delegated in almost every instance down to the states. A few states, the U.S. EPA is still regulating because the state didn't take the delegation, or they were de-delegated. They didn't do a good job, and the authority was taken back. Massachusetts used to be one.
That's really interesting.
So you were saying, there was 13 different theories.
13 theories.
And then what, so moving forward from that, what did they end up, was there ever, and I always said too, that from what I understood, we're always looking for a silver bullet, like one silver bullet. This is the cause. And in a lot of cases, that's not the case.
Well, the most common theory was that there is poultry industry, there's large. I mean, I'm just going to say it. It's the gorilla in the room, right? So everybody said, it's the poultry industry. For 20 years, they've taken a lot of hits. And people kind of envisioned landowners or poultry growers dumping litter in the river. There was no dumping of litter in the river.
Right.
There's nothing like that. There's no nefarious activity caused the fish kills. But that was one of the large theories. And so what about poultry manure? What would it be, right? So the question was, well, why them? And what would it be about manure? And so that got dug into. A lot of people said, what about Merck? What about Coors? What about, old sewer treatment facilities? What about, because there were a lot of aging infrastructure. What about this? What about that? And the question was this a local issue, a national issue? But I think I became kind of a thorn in the side of the agencies, because when I became Riverkeeper, I took it upon myself to make sure that this was in the press, that it was not forgotten, that we have had and we're continuing to have fish health issues on the Shenandoah that were not going away. That we lost an entire fishery, and I understand that was difficult in the outfitters. I think there was some friction between me and the agencies that was very real, and it went on. I was such a pain in the neck that I got a phone call from the governor's office, and he wanted to come to my house.
Really?
So Governor Kane and his security, and they came to my house, and we had a fish kill task force meeting in my living room, in my bed and breakfast.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, the guys with the earbuds and the black jackets and stuff roaming around. And
You're kidding me.
No, town of 450 in Boyce, Virginia. So he came to my house and we talked, and had some outfitters there. We had, Don Kane, Steve, a bunch of people, and the Secretary of Natural Resources was there. And we talked about the problem, and Governor Kane said, I want to help. And he earmarked some money in the budget to support the Fish Kill Task Force research, and it shined a national light on it. We were in the Boston Globe, we were in LA Times, Chicago Tribune, it was in New York Times. The fish kills here were so mysterious and difficult, and to understand the origins of, and there were so many conflicting theories. There's no real obvious smoking gun, and then it sort of died down. But the Fish Kill Task Force kept going. They funded quite a bit of research. U.S. Geological Survey really took on a lot of that research, learned things about the fish in the river that were new discoveries anywhere, including the intersex phenomenon, trying to find the origin of the intersex phenomenon. They tried then to tie contaminants in the watershed to find which ones had the most correlation to the intersex condition in the fish, with the theory that things that can cause intersex can also cause immune function problems. And if I'm asked, and I used to be asked fairly regularly, what I thought the problem was with the river was that, now this is not describing the cause of this, but my belief is, and I believe after it being my job for close to a decade to see all the science that was done and understand the fishery, it looked to me like there's an immune system problem in the fish, that the immune system function declines in the spring predictably every year. Every year we have lesions in our fish, and but not every year does it rise to the level of having a fish kill. And when I went back into the records at the Department of Environmental Quality, I went back and I did a deep dive and looked in microfilm, old reports in the papers. There have been lesions on fish in the Shenandoah since the 60s.
Wow.
And it's well documented, and everybody called it spawning stress. But I've fished every river, smallmouth river. I mean, I've caught smallmouth in I can't know how many states and 3 continents, and they don't undergo spawning stress that causes development of lesions.
So what do you think, John, on that? Because we've seen a little bit of that up at Lake Holiday too, and we're seeing it again. But so what your experience with lesions? What do you contribute that to?
Lesions, it's just like Jeff trying to describe the smoking gun. When a lesion on a fish could be caused by such a myriad of possible. First off, the fish is stressed from something. That could be spawning stress. I mean, the fish could be stressed from spawning, but you're not going to see symptomatic at a population level. I mean, you see 1 or 2 fish out of 100 with a lesion. That's nothing. I mean, that's normal.
We were getting 60-70%.
Right. And when you see 60% of population with something malady like that, an anomaly, then that's a problem at the population level.
Do people know what a lesion is?
So,
because it can come in a million different forms. I mean, you can see lesions when you can see bruising on a bass's jaw. If you hit a bone, you'll get a little dark spot there.
So, guys, above my head, there's a photo attached of the lesion on smallmouth, the one that we're talking about right now. This is the miracle of post editing versus doing a live stream right now. But what's above my head right now is what we're talking about. These are it's just John looks up.
Of course,
but, I know. I did too.
So it's a thing that really was renowned for the Shenandoah River. I remember catching fish on the Shenandoah River with these big tumors that look like on the side of them, and I think that's what we're kind of talking about here. But
they could be
essentially
strawberry.
The scales fell off. The first sign was a slight rise of the scales and a redness underneath the scales. Then the scales fell off, and then bacteria took over. There were several different types of bacteria that would colonize the wound. They would eat the flesh down to the muscle tissue, and then oftentimes a fungus. The final step was fungal development. It looked like mouse fur, gray. Fungal development would colonize and eat all the dead flesh. It was essentially the maggot of the water world, ate the dead flesh, and then a lot of times that fish would heal. Other times it would die. And the scientists looked internally, and while they had bacterial infections, I mean, one of the hot theories was that there were bacteria in the river that were preying on the fish, and there was no doubt that there were a couple bacteria that were colonizing the wounds and causing illness, but none of the fish that we sent to Virginia Tech and none of the ones that were studied by USGS actually died of systemic infection. None of them. There was no systemic infection in the wounds.
That lesion is not related to the mortality.
No, it is related. But what the scientists said that they were dying was the inability to osmoregulate. Like they were losing because their flesh, they had exposure, a large enough wound to fresh water.
Gotcha.
They were losing their calcium and magnesium. They were losing the ions in their bloodstream, and it caused many of the fish to die of a heart attack. So just like an anorexic stops eating, they're prone to dying of a heart attack. That's how anorexics die.
It sounds like a black swan event specifically, and a lot of bad factors equal this huge suck of an event. But one thing you talked about, like holiday, and I'm interested in your investigation, was there any correlation between like aquatic vegetation die-off? Was there a lack of aquatic vegetation that helped filter the water system out that could have made this an issue? Was there any other things like off the wall that you noticed on the river?
I've noticed a lot of different things on the river. A change in aquatic vegetation for sure. I mean, the last time I've seen heavy aquatic vegetation on the lower South Fork or on the main stem was 2002 at the end of the 3-year drought. In 2003 was a high water year, blew all the, particularly stargrass out, and it hasn't recolonized in any significant quantity. But this, that's another, I think that's I separate this
Separate things.
because there are places that water has, the SAVs came back. And this was widespread and appeared not to be in relation to those types of factors. Now, it could be a stressor. And what the stressor that I'm thinking of is algal blooms, particularly harmful algal blooms. We documented several species, quite a few species of blue-green algae, which can produce toxins. We did not, they just closed the North Fork last year, the Shenandoah, because of harmful algal bloom. They closed it to recreation, recommended no contact on the North Fork of the Shenandoah.
See, that always fascinated me too, because it's such a rural area down there. There's no houses. There's some farming, but Strasburg's seeing a little bit of development. But you go from like Woodstock, Tom's Brook, Murraytown, that hasn't changed in 60, 70 years. So,
that the algae was something that I spent a fair amount of the latter 5 years of my time as Riverkeeper working on, included up to and including suing the United States Environmental Protection Agency for failure to address. It's a complicated way. You have to sue the government. They let you sue them, but in a very specific way. So I sued them because they allowed Virginia to not put the Shenandoah on the impaired waters list for the algae blooms. That's right, because Virginia, I felt it was incumbent upon them to declare the Shenandoah nutrient impaired for nutrients, because what was happening was we were losing our SAVs. SAV would emerge, algae would colonize on top of the SAV, stargrass would start falling apart. It basically interrupted either the the ability to photosynthesize, or it was potentially also lysing cells on the grasses. And it was just, you'd see them emerge, and the algae would bloom, boom, they'd die, and then they'd either uproot or just break off, and then the algae would colonize, and you'd end up with just mats of blue-green algae on the bottom. Stuff. There were a couple different species that we found, all the blue-greens. They basically remind you, and they would colonize in areas where there was a solid bottom, rock or bedrock. If there was sand that moved, it wouldn't really colonize. You'd see some of it, but the movement prevented it because it didn't have a root. It's not a root system, so it's a complex layer of different types of algae, and it just looks like pudding. So if you spread pudding on the bottom, it would stay where there wasn't a lot of flow, and if there was flow, it would wipe it out. It was kind of a brownish green pudding. And then there was mats of bright green stuff. I mean, the colors I've seen in the Shenandoah, I've seen it look like a tennis ball. I mean, there's crazy algae blooms cycle through that river, different species.
Okay.
And, I believe we have a population problem, our smallmouth, in the lower half of the South Fork and in the main stem. These are also the places where we don't have grasses. Grasses they perform a lot of functions that are habitat for young fish. Right now, the river gets low after a spawn. There's nowhere for a fish to hide. They can hide under rocks and crevices and things. But those grasses are full of baby fish. The years where we've had really good reproduction, since I've been around, 97, I watched the 97 spawn. Which is after the 96 floods. 2004 and 2005 kind of ironically were good years, even though the years we experienced the fish kills, 2007 and 2013. And we have not had a good spawn since 2013. So we're 9 years out. We did last year have a killer spawn. So the fishing has, if asked why is the fishing decline? Well, there's a lot of things that cause a decline of a fishery. And then if they all come together at the same time, you end up with a fishery like we have. The guides last year, in many cases, stopped fishing portions of the Potomac because they would catch no fish. I mean, fish for 10 hours and not see a smallmouth bass. Correct. Places where they would, in the 80s and the 90s, they would catch 300 in a day. And so the primary driver is reproduction.
Right.
I think the game department showed that long time ago. Your fishery is driven by year classes. And what does that mean? Okay, year classes. So 97, 2004, 2005, 2007, 2013. Those are our big year classes where you had way above average spawn. Those fish are robust fish. They generally, my experience is if you ask me, I watched all those spawns. And I'm not going to tell you the date because I don't like to focus people's attention, but their spawn window is 3 days. In each of those years, it was the same 3 days. Everything culminated. And so my experience has been, is that when we have massive reproduction, it all comes together and coalesces in the same time. And literally every male is on a nest, and the males and females are all going through the courting process on the same day.
Really?
All of them in a region.
Wow.
Literally. When it's organized. And when it organizes like that, those are the years we have killer reproduction.
Gotcha.
And it organized like that last year.
That gets back to the thing we talked about earlier, the phenomena sort of when it's good.
Right.
And the recruitment in these cases does not seem to be density dependent. I mean, in other words, it doesn't matter how many young are spawned, nobody's lacking for resources at that time.
Right.
So when we also learned a long time ago that flow is one of the primary drivers, but in your experience, have you been able to discern other things in that narrow window, like maybe a moon phase or barometric pressure that would add it? Because we know that the flow is a primary driver, right, but it can't just be flow.
It's a number of factors.
Right.
And during COVID, when I had nothing else to do, I graphed I went back and I gave a presentation to the PRSC on this. I should share it with you guys. I graphed those windows, 97. I went back and got USGS data, water temp, water levels, and all the places that I know I know with my eyes when fish spawn. Now there's a water level window that they like.
Right.
They don't like it to be too much below that, and they don't like it to be above that.
Right.
When it gets too much below it, what happens is their spawning areas become too quiet. And they like quiet, protected areas because they're a nest sweeper. They sweep a nest. They basically uncover chicken egg size rock. They sweep away the fines, the sands, and the gravels, and the shells. And then you look in the bottom of the nest, it looks like a bunch of chicken eggs. And the eggs are slightly sticky, and they adhere to, if you have a rock and it's 3 inches around, they adhere to the perimeter of the rock. They're not on the dome. They're in the crevices. They look like little sesame seeds. And they're there depending on water temp. If the water accelerates in the 70s, they hatch quick. If it stays in the 60s, then it takes 3 to 6 days. And if it drops below 56 degrees, the males abandon. So if you go into that window and then it drops down, if the eggs are laid and the male's there and they're fertilized, you drop below 56 degrees, every time you'll wholeheartedly lose all your nests. And we lost them this year. We had an April 15th spawn this year, and those males abandoned because we had a snow after one of the spawns. It was crazy cold.
That's very.
So it's temperature too. And so
because all I was thinking about, all I ever thought about was flood, and like you said earlier too about flood. Like you were talking about drought. I can see now we're drought. So again, we talk about how much we learn, and I learn every time we do these things. Drought as well as flood. But to your point now, that's really good information. That water, just the level and the temperature.
So the river, if you look at a graph of the river, it's going up and down.
You're saying our spawn class this year is not going to be good.
No, but we did lose the early, the big fish, big males sweep first. Big females are grab it early. And then when it gets shattered, when that first round gets shattered, it just becomes disorganized, and you don't get it doesn't come together all at once. And you get reproduction, but you don't get that wave of reproduction. If you want one of those 97, 2004, 2007, 2013 spawns, it all happened. Those years, all the conditions come together, and then it's like wham. And
if conditions the rest of this month are good, meaning normal flows, I think we could probably still have a good year class this year. It might not be epic.
That's right. So it's not only are your babies getting born, it's do you have the flows after that? And the first thing I saw that indicated that, they did a study on the Rappahannock, the game department showed that it was June flows had a lot to do with it. And June flows is when they're surviving, right? So if you have a big event in when the fry are very young, well, once they eat their yolk sac, they're a predator in the system now. They're having to find food and eat it. Large fish, we saw this first in 96, can become kind of go into a torpor and really not feed in long, prolonged high water events. In 2018, we had the same thing. The fish really didn't grow that year. There was very little feeding. But those young can't. They don't have any body mass. It's just similar to why a 3-inch, you have to get to 3 inches to make it through the winter in a lot of climates, because they just don't have enough body mass to make it through without feeding. They're not going to feed all winter.
Gotcha.
And so those young, it's not a very long window of time where those young just die from starvation if your water's cloudy for a couple weeks.
So in a lot of
they're sight feeders.
And a lot of
depth.
impoundments, they look
Okay.
at striped bass and they just say they cannot actually on their own sustain a breeding program. This is a lot of impoundments across the United States. And so you have to do supplemental stocking. At what point do you have to have a failure rate over 10, 15, 20 years where clearly the smallmouth in these certain ecosystems cannot self-sustain and we need to have a supplementation? Like what point do we actually look at it that way?
I'm not ready to say that we need to have augmented stocking in the river, but it sure wouldn't hurt.
But like for striper, like they do have a failure rate depending on certain
So
impoundment where
in the
they can't-
Shenandoah, when the conditions are right, they reproduce like crazy. We don't have a reproductory problem. So what we have is a weather problem. And what has happened is, you know,
You might remember the
March.
offer.
What do they say? March roars in.
Comes in like
what's
a
the
lion,
saying?
goes
It's
Yeah,
like a
lame or
lion, was that
something.
like lamb?
right. And April rains, May. What is it?
Yeah.
May
Flowers.
flowers. Right. Well, we're not getting April rains. We're getting May rains. And so I can tell you, we can go back and look at the water levels. I mean, we're at like 7 inches of rain already in May this year, and the average is 3.5. And that has
Right.
happened so many of the last
Right.
15 to 18 years where it hasn't rained in April. If you look at the old graphs, you know, if you go back in the 70s and what's available, go back in the old USGS data, you get your highest median flow is April, and then it starts to subside, right? As the trees leaf out, grass emerges, you get a lot of absorption of rainwater. You move from mesoscale rain events, which are valley-wide, to thunderstorms that lay stripes of water, down through the valley, and so you don't get as many of these large rises in water level that mess up a spawn. But we're not getting those April rains. We're getting below average April or average April rains, and we're getting above average May rains. So just as they're getting to their prime time, either to produce young or for those young to weather and grow up in the system and get out of that, they got to get to like an inch and then they're viable. To get into that viability stage is when we're getting a lot of high muddy water, and it's just knocking them out. So it's not only just destroying nests, the improperly timed either drop in temperature or high water event will just destroy the nest. I mean, those eggs are sticky, but they're not really sticky. They're stickier than largemouth, and that's why largemouth can lay eggs on a tree stump. I mean, and they'll stay there. But they're also spawning in currentless water,
Right.
mostly. Smallmouth 1 point. We measured it. So me and Vicky Blazer went out and stood in nests, stuck it, and took flow meters at various levels above the nest, and the optimal flow rate is 0.03 meters a second.
And you were saying that supplementation stocking would benefit or would not benefit?
I think it's always a benefit, but we don't know how much you have to do to actually move the needle on the catch rates. They did you guys did the Rappahannock study.
Yeah.
That was yours, wasn't it?
We did the Rappahannock, we did the Stanton, and one other one. The problem was production. Right, smallmouth are really hard fish to raise,
That's
and right now we don't have the pond space to do it. We don't have the capacity to raise nearly enough fish to make a difference. And I, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we buy fish from private vendors. Right now, there's no private vendor that's producing anywhere near the number of fish that we would need to stock in one river system to make up for multiple failed year classes, enough for an angler would even recognize that something happened.
To raise a smallmouth, do you have to like mimic the same environment they're from, like a river type environment, or can you do it in a pond? Like, how does that process work that makes them so finicky?
Well, I don't think it's finicky actually getting them to spawn. I think
Okay.
it's they're needy in the early life stages in the process.
Is that the problem they're having?
I'm not a hatchery person, so I'm going to take a pass on this one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
fine. Yeah.
I mean,
I've never-
Maryland took a swipe at it.
Yeah.
They've been collecting fish for a couple of years and trying to get them reproduced, and they're having a heck of a time getting reproduction. They've gotten some. They've had some successes, and they put those fish back in the river.
We've tried it. We tried it a number of years, and the numbers of fish based on our electrofishing average numbers of young of year per mile, we calculated we would need. One of the papers that we did earlier, we estimated biomass and density number of fish per kilometer and biomass per kilometer of both young a year and adults. And so that gave us a realistic starting point when we're trying to figure out, hey, if you want to, try to either supplement or recreate a missing year class in one of these rivers, how many fish are you going to need to stock? And so we could put a realistic number around that with a confidence interval. And we didn't even get close to that number of fish. So one of the reasons we chose the Rappahannock was a smaller system and would need as many fish to try to, make maybe the needle move a little bit. But we couldn't even get the number of fish that we wanted. And even the number of fish that we got, they just weren't even showing up in our surveys.
Interesting.
So we've basically tabled this notion of supplemental smallmouth stocking until more technology or more logistically, facilities become available. This whole thing with Front Royal Fish Cultural Station and the improvements were supposed to happen there. That was one of the things, sort of the pie in the skies, the ideas that we were looking at was having that be a major production modern facility to create, hundreds of thousands of smallmouth bass fingerlings. Whether or not that'll ever happen, it remains to be seen.
Did you want to go into the Front Royal thing?
Yeah, and I remember because we've talked before about Lake Holiday, and what we found, and we had the vegetation thing, too many grass carp put in, lost all the vegetation. It's only changed the fishery. But what we found, John Reedy, you got to give him credit. He was from Pennsylvania, but he now lives up here resident and has time to be on. He was on the fishery committee and the board. But his research showed that, which I didn't realize this, but smallmouth lay considerably fewer eggs than the largemouth. And then when we looked at the supplemental stocking, I swear he looked at 200 to 300 across the country hatcheries before he came across one in Ohio, Fender's Hatchery, that was able to bring us smallmouth. Now, of course, crazy. He's outsourcing too on different things. Walleye, he had some walleye, and
are all the other hatcheries raising largemouth and other species?
Mouth.
And they were all were raising largemouth. You were saying
these hatcheries, like trying to find one specific to smallmouth.
That's what I'm saying. So they were producing other species.
Other
not
species,
just trout, but like they're doing other warm water species like largemouth and sunfish.
But couldn't find the smallmouth because we were looking specific smallmouth, and so we're in our third. We do it every 2 years, third stocking. But to your point too. But see, we're in a lake too, so it's not quite as diverse, deeper, a little bit easier for them to survive. So we're still a drop in the bucket what we're paying. We're spending probably $18,000 every 2 years, and I forget what our exact numbers are. But anyway, to that point, yes, it's not, and I understand what you're saying. It's kind of like, is it just a drop in the bucket, really, when you think about it? Is it really worth the time? And it is. It's a tough thing. Now, as far as the Front Royal, I don't know where they're at. Like I said, I did hear that, rumor they're wanting to get it started back up, and there was, questions about.
There's money set aside to do it. I admit I've lost track, and we should have Mark Frondorf on the shows. He's currently the Shenandoah Riverkeeper, would have more current information.
No, that'd be good.
Or Steve, or on one of his crew, who would be up to date. But there was the idea that they were going to bring it back as a warm water, possibly walleye, possibly muskie, possibly smallmouth. And there's NERDA money, Natural Resource Damage Assessment money, from the DuPont settlement, from the old mercury pollution that occurred between 1929 and 1950. They eventually monetized it. It was monetized as a value of the loss of smallmouth fishing days, or fishing days on the river, not smallmouth. And one of the ways it was thought that they could augment and give back the lost fishing days was stocking, habitat improvement, improving access to create more opportunities for fishing and better fishing.
So quick question to you for you, John, and I know you're not the hatchery guy, but you talked before about trout. So where does in the funds that go into, and I go, this is not your purview, but how does the state look at that as far as the trout stocking versus these other fish or species, and what goes into that? And again, I understand this is not necessarily your area, but to your knowledge.
Well, we've got warm water hatchery system and a cold water hatchery system. Smallmouth, obviously, we're talking warm water hatchery system. We rely a lot on, more so now probably than we used to, on our angler survey too. We've got a new survey, and we're asking people, our constituents, what are they targeting? So we can actually, we know now, what percentage of our anglers are targeting, stock trout versus smallmouth bass versus, and I can tell you, largemouth and smallmouth are still the winners. And so that'll help justify improvements, and upgrades. As we move forward, potentially, especially if we continue with these erratic flow conditions, which seems to be exacerbating, our smallmouth populations in most of these rivers. There was just a recent a publication that came out. I can't remember the primary author. There was a whole slew of authors, but the primary author, and it was one of those. It was a peer-reviewed pub. It was one of the Elsevier products, I think, maybe Rivers and something ecosystems. But it was a highly technical, major analysis of flow regimes in a lot of East Coast rivers, Mid-Atlantic, and maybe even Northern Atlantic, and looking at multiple primarily centrarchids, sunfish species, rock bass, smallmouth, redbreast, and the downward trends. So many of these populations and so many of these rivers attributed primarily to just these erratic flows that Jeff was referencing. The fact that just in the 4 years I've lived in Rappahannock, Battle Run near my house has had like 3 500-year storm events.
Wow.
Okay, well, I'm not sure why they call them 500-year storm events anymore, right? They happen every year.
Anymore.
So it's things like that, or the reasons, one of the primary reasons we're having poor year classes, because the reproductive, the life history strategy of the smallmouth, as Jeff has so eloquently described, is not suited to deal with that repeated 500-year storm event.
So will it continue? That's the question, right? Are we seeing a decadal change? Are we seing a big change? Is this a climate change?
And here to stay.
Is this a change in the, is this as simple as El Nino, La Nina?
Right.
Those can affect East Coast weather. Are we going to see this? We've seen it for 15 years. I don't want to see it for another 15 years, but
what is the data point? Is it we have to wait 100 years before we say
know.
it is?
I don't really know.
I was just curious, like what is it though?
That's a
You
good
said
question.
15 years.
I guess I've never done it, but we could go back as far as USGS data shows and see what the longest window we have would be their data, flow data, but it would need to be pretty detailed. A lot of the stuff started in the 70s. A lot of those gauges are really, they don't go much back further than the 70s, and so
it's got to be over like 20 years before it's like this is the
I
new
don't know.
normal.
But we had some
ask
damn
a
good
scientist.
we had some damn good smallmouth populations in our rivers in the 80s.
Yeah, you'd have to ask. You'd have to ask.
80s and early 90s, and
you'd have to ask a statistician how many years you have to go back to determine whether this is a wave or a trend.
Yeah.
And it is interesting though, because I relate to what you're saying, because I can remember early 90s floating in North Fork and just like phenomenal fish rates and catches and size and everything.
Right.
And then to your point, yes, then it hit that, and it was like on a smaller river like the North Fork, and where it's crystal clear, even floating, even if you're not catching them, you're just seeing.
There's no secrets on the North Fork, is what we always say.
I mean,
like,
they're
if there's
squirting
fish,
here,
you
they're
see
going
them.
everywhere to see them, and then it was like the Dead Sea; they were gone. And so here you talk about those percentages. Now, I will say though, and in here, we're seeing the pictures come across now with social media and stuff. Man, seeing there was a 21 incher caught right above Route 7, and they're weighing. They're back to weighing 20-pound bags in tournaments and stuff. So I mean, that's a good average.
Our brood fish are there.
What's that?
Our brood fish are there.
Right.
They're there from the 13 class, and possibly still some left from the 7 class.
So there's
fish,
still it's such a resilient resource though too, where it is you're gonna have those down years, but that thing, give it a couple years, and to your point, I guess because of spawn classes, couple years and the food is there, it bounces back, and then you're talking about the memorable catches. I mean, you're starting to see that again. So kind of to your point, I go back to the cycle. I hear a lot of people are cutting. I get it, but at the same time, just wait. If we just wait long enough, it should come back around, I guess. Now, bottom might fall out again. Right.
When I joke with Kelble and Brian Tro from Mossy Creek, we say, we joke about, there's a month in the spring where hardly anything can live in the Shenandoah, and so if we can avoid fish kills, then it's just down to reproduction. Right. So we need to produce the fish, and then they just have to stay healthy. Right. And then there's angler contribution, and we can get into that's a whole other topic of conservation. I believe very strongly that there's mortality associated with deep hooking fish with soft plastics, because I see it. Okay. And I know it. Mm-hmm. And I think that it used to be game department used to have a creel survey, like how many fish are people eating? Well, now it should be, if you caught 100 fish, you probably killed 3 or 4 if you're using soft plastics, almost without a doubt. And if you got blood, I mean, the arteries in a fish run from the heart through the gills straight to the body. They don't go back to the heart to beat. They have 2 chambers, and they don't go like we have 4 chambers. And so it's going through. And if you look down in the throat of a fish, and you see that little you see what looks like it's the esophagus, it's the wrinkles of the throat, right?
Yep.
If your hook is aimed down, you're hooking one of their arteries. You're hooking one of the 2 arteries that feed their gills, which goes directly to their body, and they're going to bleed out internally. They're dead.
So let's talk about 2 things.
If your fish is puffing blood when it comes in, and I've had fish where I can see when it jumps, and when I was a guide, I'd be like, damn, I can see the blood coming out of its gills already.
Should they be cutting that hook, cutting that off and leave the hook in there? I've heard.
I do not believe leaving the hook because it's a barrier of feeding properly. And what's going to happen is they're moving that hook every time they feed around that. They try to take the bill. Let's move that hook. Imagine something inside you going like this. I mean, if you get an arrow in your side, they stabilize it, and then they take you to the hospital to have it removed, right? So you got.
Now, there is stories though where it will, and again, I understand
it is not going to rust out. The hooks
but it
are
might
so good today.
Like I had somebody just tell a story where they kind of pulled it out, and again,
that's because they ate the bait. They ate it. They didn't get gut hooked.
Okay.
They ate it, consumed it.
But this was a hook, though. This was a hook was coming out.
I understand, but that hook was in a bait that they swallowed. It wasn't hooked into their throat.
I'm following you now.
So I do not like the idea of leaving a hook in a fish.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's a great technique for removing them. You stick your finger in the gill. Don't worry, the gills are pretty tough.
Okay.
You actually go underneath the first gill. You take and you put your finger over the line and the eye of the hook, and you pull it out the gill, and then you push forward. So what it does is it rotates that hook from aiming out of the fish's mouth. You rotate it like this, and then you push it straight out. And 90% of the time, you leave that fish will not be bleeding when you're done doing that maneuver. And if you catch the artery, then you're done. Yeah. That's what you can do about it. I mean, Al Lindner was the first person to advertise that, and I've saved thousands of fish using that.
So we can probably check that out. Al Lindner, maybe.
I mean, we should do.
Yeah, there'll be a link to a gut hook video down below in the episode description. One thing
it used to be people would cut the hook, and then I just think rotating it out is so quick and so simple. Once you master that technique, I wouldn't do it with a really toothy fish. But
and the idea too, the other thing I was going to say, don't let that happen by getting a better hook set. And again, I know it's
inevitable once
in a while, and maybe.
When I was a guide, this is what I did, and not everybody will do this because I don't think everybody has someone yelling at them, or it's hard to stop catching fish when you're catching them.
Right.
One gut hook, I would try to figure out what it was that he did. Was there too much limp line? Did he not identify the bite? Right. I would usually be able to identify a bite at or about the same time the angler would. If they're not identifying, I would say, you've got a fish on, please reel down. Let's get it hooked before it swallows. But there are certain days, and it starts in May, where I call them like milkshake days. When you suck a milkshake through a straw, it goes right to your throat. You don't chew it. That's what they're doing. They suck it they literally suck it down, and it hardly passes the crushers, and it's in their throat. Okay. And it's instantaneous.
I see.
And if you've got one of those days, and it's not every day, if you've got one of those days and you're throwing a tube, which they love to swallow, throw a jig and pig. They will not swallow a jig and pig.
Right.
The only time I've ever seen a smallmouth swallow a jig and pig was a 21-inch male on a bed, and it ate it. It ate it gone. We were able to get it out. But they will not swallow a jig and pig. If you're throwing a Senko, go to a super fluke. You're going to probably get a drop off if they're after the Senko profile, and they've been caught 27,000 times by a super fluke. I don't think anybody's fishing them anymore. But in the 90s and 2000s, man, those fish knew how that thing drifted down. You couldn't catch a big fish on a super fluke after about 3 or 4 years. But they haven't really patterned the Senkos because I think there's less to look at, less to be bothered by it.
I think it's such a smallmouth thing too. I've caught smallmouth from like Lake Erie to Tennessee, and compared to a largemouth, I would say I deep hook smallmouth way more than largemouth. Per species, which I wonder how much that plays into it too. They're just more aggressive.
Well, I think the education back before, and I'm just saying, I've fished with a guy that it's kind of like the line swimming away. I'm like, set the hook, man. I'm with you. And I guess
it can be a horror show.
Like John's saying, it can happen. It's going to happen to the best of us.
I had guys whose laps would be red from blood, and I would eventually. This was early in my guide career before I kind of felt like I could take control of my boat. I just stopped allowing it. I just said, let's not go hook anymore. This is what I need. I'd like you to do. We'll go through it. And then, if they were following the instructions, they usually eliminated the gut hooks, not always. But if we just had one of those days, either I had a guy who I call had ham hands, like his hands are made of ham, he could never feel anything. There's people like that, no matter what you do, they just can't feel anything. And they can't see the line. You just got to get them off of the lethal baits. You just got to. And if you're fishing and you're gut hooking fish after fish, I know these fishermen love this fishery. We all love this fishery. You got to have the discipline to manage yourself and come off those baits. You
Right.
just got to come off them. Maybe go to a straight line bait, a chuck and wind bait, something that's slightly different size. It's got some, put a weed guard on it so that they feel something, so they spend more time in the crushers. It's those really small profile baits that are slippery that they just go right down their throat. The Senkos, the tubes, sometimes super flukes. If you give them enough time, they'll eat them gone.
I'm not trying to sell something here,
the
but
spawning fish will eat them fast.
Yeah, some of these newer rods. I mean, when you go, and I'm by no means am I trying to upsell, but there is sensitivity, and I'm one of these too that never bought into them. Like I can catch one with
the ugly sticks, man.
Yeah,
the sensitive
ugly
rod
stick, man.
in the world.
Can't break it, whatever. But when you go to that, you can definitely tell the sensitivity, and all that relates to it too is you're gonna catch more fish, but you're also, once you do feel that, they've got it. They're not putting it in their pocket or anything. I mean, it's in their mouth, so set the hook.
Right. And on a river, bite detection is all about line management.
Right.
That's what it's about. If you've got the right amount of slack or pressure to your bait, you'll feel that bite. And if you lose contact with your bait, you miss that bite. And it's about line management.
To the talented angler too. That's a huge thing. I mean, if you had a couple of the Bassmasters compared to Joe Schmo's his first time out there, I think the ratio of gut hooked fish would be leaning towards one way.
And it's something you don't talk about a lot. We don't talk about detection. You don't talk about it based on the different lures that you're throwing. Another thing that goes along with that too is in lakes, deep water, the deep fish with the bladder. Maybe talk to that a little bit, John. When you're bringing them up out of the depths, and then that bladder, the fizzing, I guess, or whatever. That can also
deep enough that we do.
Yeah, we don't here. Anna, maybe some stripers.
Right.
In the winter, maybe.
Smith Mountain, maybe.
Yeah, which I don't deal much with fizzing as an agency. Some agencies actually have a brochure or recommendations for fizzing. Just due to the nature of our fisheries here, we don't and haven't seen the need for it.
Is it deeper than 30 feet?
I think it sort of depends on the system and how it stratifies.
Okay.
It may be purely depth. I don't know.
I literally have no experience with it. So
we've seen a little bit up at Lake Holiday because it does. I mean, it's 80 to 90 feet down the dam, so I mean it's possible. And
are fish down that deep then?
Well, 20 to 30 foot.
Okay.
I'm just saying you have that kind of depth. So we're not really catching that deep, but 20 to 30 feet. Yeah. It's not uncommon.
So when we fished up at the St. Lawrence for a college tournament, and we fished down at Kiwi which is just above Lake Hartwell. They told us about fizzing them because of the time of year it was. We were catching spotted bass. It was 80 feet deep, plus 100, and you're just video game fishing. But it was, you put them in the live well, they would flip right up. And so they told us beforehand because we're all college because we didn't know any better. But I didn't know if it was a cue of either, like you said, is it striation of the water columns? Is it just because they were too deep?
It's probably just depth, pressure.
Yeah. That's what
Any truth to the Mountain Dew? Have you heard about the Mountain Dew and pouring it down their throat when you're talking about the gut hook? I mean, I swear by
for what?
So if you
it'll make them barf, it'll make a fish barf.
But if you take soda and you pour it down there, it's to help the blood start, cauterize the wound, so to speak.
Well, I can tell you this. I learned this the hard way, is that smallmouth bass blood and probably fish blood doesn't coagulate in the air as fast as it does in the water.
Interesting.
Okay.
It just doesn't.
Right.
So if you're holding that fish, there have been times where, if you hook a fish in the, where the tongue, the rakers come into the tongue, arteries right in there, it's under their tongue, right? So if you, and it happens occasionally, particularly with downturn hooks, and it happens, with downturn hooks we use in the industry, mostly flies, right, that are oriented like this, and you get a lot more tongue hooked fish with flies than you do with spin tackle, and it does occasionally get into that. This it looks like this, and you get into that crook, and you've hit the jackpot. You've hit the main artery, and man, there are times where I've had a big fish. I'll stick my finger on it, and I'll hold it underwater, and it coagulates quickly underwater, but it will not in air. It just seems to make sense. I mean, it's a different, probably a coagulation process. I've never read it, I've never heard it, but I've observed it. To get those, you got to get this fish in the water. If you're doing some surgery and that fish is really blowing a lot of blood out, you got to get it in the water. Maybe that's what the Mountain Dew does. It expands, and maybe it's just the contact with water. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the thing I was always taught growing up too. John, one question I had for you: now that the snakehead almost has a cult of personality around it, where you have Facebook groups and tournaments dedicated to it, is there any change in the way it is viewed by the department now that you have more and more people saying like, hey, we actually like this thing? Or has your view of them, the department, changed over the years, or is it the same message?
I don't think that there hasn't been any real shift in sort of the conventional wisdom of the leadership in the agency in deeming that it's still a bad thing. I think there's been an acknowledgement that relates to R3, which is an initiative that most state agencies are embarking on, which stands for recruitment, reactivation, and retention, I think. Essentially trying to maintain and increase the number of anglers. Just because without licensed anglers, then we don't exist, because we're still a user fee funded agency, one of the few left. And if there was ever a poster child for R3, it's the northern snakehead. I've never seen people so excited about fishing as I've a lot of people, like you just referenced, with just head over heels in love with getting in their kayak and going on a mission, chasing snakes. I mean, you go on there's a zillion places on YouTube, you can see it, and it's phenomenal, the excitement that it's caused. And of course, then some might say, well, yeah, but this excitement is creating people moving this fish, and they're causing more controversy and alarm. Yes, that is happening, and it's something we've tried to prevent by adding the snakehead the same level as blue cat in terms of intentionally moving and introducing it as a class 1 misdemeanor, which is a fairly hefty crime, at least how compared to what it used to be. But we don't want people moving fish, period. Live fish should not be moved ever for any reason, unless you want to take one home and put it in your pond. That's pretty much the only thing or an aquarium. That's the only thing I can think of. But in terms of an angler or constituent introducing a member of the public, introducing a fish to another water body, a public water body, there's absolutely no reason for it. If the habitat's there and it makes scientific and ecological sense, we're probably going to put that fish there.
So you look at how the goby has really changed a lot of those fisheries. And at some point it's like, it's here, we just got to deal with it. Do you think that how much time will have to elapse before it's like the snakehead is just here, it's just a part of the ecosystem and we can't get it out? Like, or is it just going to be an on-fighting war to try to eliminate it completely? Like, what's the vibe there going forward?
Well, so we're 20 years into it now, and the upper tidal freshwater Potomac was introduced in 2004. So we're closing in on 2 decades. It was there for probably 4 years before we knew it. So I think we're safely at 20 years. But we can say, since I like to try to quantify the responses and the trends that we see based on discovery. So discovery was 2004. So we're 18 years. I think we've already seen the peak abundance, the maximum that we're going to see in these systems, what this fish can afford. People that would argue with me might say, well, the blue catfish took 30 years to reach peak abundance, which I think we've already seen that, and I think that's on its way down. To that, I would say, well, what's the maximum lifespan and the maximum size between those two species? For the snakehead, the maximum lifespan is probably 10, maybe 12 years. Blue catfish, you're probably talking 30, 35 years easily. Max size, you're talking maybe 20 pounds versus 150 pounds. So we're not talking about apples and apples. We're talking about apples and something else. I just don't think, based on what I've been able to discern over the years with snakeheads and observing them, that we're going to see an insane abundance. Like initially it looked like might happen on the Potomac, but it didn't. It's topped out. And so between the assimilation and exploitation factors, I don't see it, reaching a level of a nuisance status or of ecosystem interference status in the systems where it is now. It could end up in a different system, but barring a threatened and endangered fish in a system that it would do well in, the snakehead would do well in, like a coastal plain swampy type system. You just don't see that fish doing well in the habitats. It shows up in trout streams now and then it's gone. It doesn't do anything. That's been going on for 15 years. It migrates into a system on an apparent, pre-spawning migration, range expansion, whatever, and then it's gone because it doesn't like that habitat. It likes slow water. It likes silty, sandy bottoms with vegetation. It doesn't like high gradients. It doesn't like cobble. Doesn't like boulders. So if it's not in its preferred habitat, it's
not going to survive.
It's not even really on the radar.
Now, the world record is out of Fredericksburg, is it not?
It is.
Where's it at?
Fredericksburg.
Either Quiet Creek or
snake.
Potomac Creek.
Cool. Yeah.
And that's why I can almost see it's like a storyboard where it's like the beginning was we have these terrible sci-fi movies that's going to kill your dog to 10 years from now. Like the government's promoting like this is the world-class snakehead fishery because people are going to travel from all over. And it's just such a weird arc that we're getting there. And you're starting to see it where there are Facebook groups like,
well, you're going to see it on menus more and more. I believe you'll see it on it because it is.
I'm not the game department, and I've become pretty fatalistic about the fact that we're just going to have everything everywhere at a certain point. They're all going to get mixed. I mean, all the species are going to be everywhere. It's the arc of time right now that we're looking at. I mean, 160 years ago, William Shriver put smallmouth in the Potomac system. Now we got them in Germany. They're in South Africa. I caught them in the Breeder River in South Africa. I mean, they're going to be everywhere. They're they're wasting the native population there. The native, the South Africans hate them. We love them. They've been here 160 years. 160 years, will they love them in South America? When South Africa?
Smallmouth.
Probably, because they won't have the memory of the yellow bass that they're replacing. And so
this has been your public service now. We all live and we all die.
I get to take unpopular opinions. I don't know. I mean, we got Flathead coming up the Potomac. They're whacking away pretty good at the. So talk about additional pressure on smallmouth recovery. Well, they're eating young smallmouth, and to some degree, they're eating sunfish to some degree.
More predation.
Yeah, and it just slows recovery of the smallmouth.
What are your thoughts about I think 8 pound, we're talking about records, like a state record smallmouth was out of the New River back, I think in the 80s.
Donnie Eaton caught it
8
in 2003.
Was it registered?
March 12th.
Was it registered?
I got to see that fish in the tank at the bait store.
Was it registered?
Yeah. That's the one, 8-1, and then a kid caught it.
8-1. Okay, yeah. Okay.
The kid caught it. Yeah, Donnie.
Gotcha. So
the previous record was 2003.
And so, out of the new. I did hear that. Then he caught it on the bank.
And then a kid caught it about 10 days later and brought it in. It was the same exact weight.
Is that right?
Caught it on a minnow at the campground across the river.
What? Where if it is broken, where will it be broken?
Smallmouth in Virginia.
Smallmouth.
It's a New River.
Yeah, still
probably. Although,
Clater, maybe.
Did you see that fish that fly rod caught fish that up in the Upper James?
Yeah.
No.
That Blaine Chocolate's client caught.
No.
It's the second time or third time he's caught it over the course of 4 years.
My next question: if
that
it
fish
is
was
caught,
25.5 inches, and it was
How long?
enormous. It looked like a tadpole. 25.5 inches.
Wow.
And they caught and released it. They released it.
Now we did see one that was 2 ounces shy of the state record about 10 years ago at the Thompson Wildlife Management Area.
Yes, I heard about
What's
this.
it even doing in there?
Well, think about it. Before that,
trout?
Yes, we have long said if we want to grow trophy bass,
trout, right?
Yes, feed them rainbow trout.
Yes, thank you.
And we actually want to do that, but we get crucified by our trout anglers.
Did you hear about the muskie they caught down at Little Falls in the Potomac? It was like 38 inches and 42 pounds. It was eating shad. They caught it in the shad migration.
Was it like square?
Looked like a keg with fin coming out the back.
I love how you mentioned that though, because when you guys dump trout at Wilkinson Lake in Winchester, I'm always there with my Huddlestons because I've caught a 6 and a 7 pound largemouth out of that pond because when they stock, they start feeding.
Little rainbow trout swim bait.
Yeah,
Clearbrook, like all the waters here that are stocked with trout, like they're fat. I can show you pictures.
Yeah,
their girth is, and that's because they're eating trout.
Yeah,
and I love it.
There's going to be some 7-inch, 8-inch runts in every load.
But why? And I understand
bass.
a stream, but a rainbow trout fisherman on a stream versus a lake. But here's the cool thing about it, like too, you catch the trout, you're going after trout, you throw it in the frying pan. But the ones you don't catch, the bass are eating, and everybody loves catching that big, fat largemouth. I mean, I'm sorry, it's a win-win in my mind. But
it's an expensive forage species.
I mean, it's easy for me to say. But what I'm saying though, but it's not a forage species. It's still some people are targeting that. They're going there to fish and catch trout.
I don't know if you read, like that's why California was frustrated with their kokanee program because they were dumping kokanee in these lakes and they were creating these massive these spotted bass, like these world records, but they were also spending a ton of money on this kokanee program.
Right? No, I understand that.
All right, I heard you mention spotted bass twice now. We got to squash that.
Oh yeah, you want to start with that one too? Okay. I guess it's.
So my buddy's catching hybrids on the new in sandstone.
We're also talking about Gadsden's going to be the heart
hybridized Kentuckys, I think, aren't they?
we genotyped a bunch of them. There's a bunch of mutts that have smallmouth, spot, and Alabama in them.
In
three-way.
where it's because he's on the New River.
The
He's in
new
one
and the
too.
James
Are
now.
you serious?
So
That's great.
you want to, so we'll set this up. So basically, there's a Kentucky bass invasion. I know it's like the James and new, but the ones I've heard about is also Kerr and Gaston.
Yeah.
And the rumor is people have been stocking them in there because of the blueback, because they're trying to make the Hartwell of this, basically of Virginia, is kind of the quote unquote what I've heard from bass anglers. So floor is yours. What's going on?
The
with the
problem
Kentucky
is again, we don't want people moving fish. Well-intentioned bass anglers think that they're going to catch more bass if they stock spots. The problem is, number one, it's already been documented. The spots outcompete largemouth, and you end up with a whole lake full of small spots. So if you want to go out and catch 100 bass in a day and not one of them is going to be over a pound, then okay, illegally stock spots. The other problem is a lot of this people, they think they're putting spots in, they're not. They're putting either Alabama spot hybrids in, or they're putting in pure Alabamas. And what's already been documented in multiple states, we're having a symposium at the Southern Division AFS meeting we're hosting in February about how spots are screwing up the whole Southeast bass fishery. They're screwing up smallmouth because they're interbreeding. They're screwing up largemouth because they're out competing. And so we could actually have in our smallmouth rivers, the Rappahannock, the Shenandoah, the James, the New, we could lose the entire face of smallmouth bass. They could be gone, and we'll end up with this weird mutt that's a third smallmouth, a third Alabama, and a third spotted bass.
Could you talk about that to the people at home that don't understand it? That the spotted bass, even the Alabama River, and the spotted bass are in California that grow to be like 1,000 pounds. Those massive ones. That's not the same one that's necessarily being introduced.
No. They're just different species, or they're hybrids of different species, and the way they're hybridizing with our species, they're creating something entirely deficient. And
Where are they seen it on the James? Upper
James, yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I think there were George Palmer's fish, so that would be
Yeah.
Buena Vista.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean it's a real. I mean, it kind of dwarfs what blue cats and snakeheads. I mean, it could be a really, really bad thing for bass fishermen.
That's depressing.
So, I mean, that goes to, too, I know that's what we do up Lake Holiday. We run everything through the state. So, like, before we stock anything, we're basically getting the permitting required by the state and getting that signed off, which comes with also health papers from that hatchery that says that, because we don't just buy fish from just anywhere, making sure that there's a clean
smallmouth, right?
Well, we're doing smallmouth. We did walleye, and we did black crappie last year.
Okay, but you're not stocking other
No, not great. But as we look at, we're tossing around the Florida strain. I
wouldn't do that.
Why not?
Well, so you're stocking smallmouth, which tells me it's a cool water lake. Florida Lake, hot water. I think Florida.
What about Lake Frederick though? My challenge to that is Lake Frederick's got some.
What do you mean,
Florida
Lake we own? Lake Frederick? DGI
Lake
Lake?
Frederick right here, yeah. Is it not? I think it has a northern.
I think that was
think it is
stocked.
I can't catch a bass there.
I think that's one of the lakes that was more recently stocked, and maybe in the stock with F1s, or potentially even in a very small window of time when we did experimentally try pure Floridas, and because of that, the allele percentage is skewed towards higher Florida.
So, but my question is, my thought, because it goes back to what you're saying before, and this is good. I love these discussions because I'm all about the information, knowledge, and educating myself. And maybe the why, but so like 11 pounder caught last year out of Lake Frederick. So that potential, that genetic potential. Okay. So now, and I realize too, and the problem with Lake Holiday too, we are a little bit farther north. It's colder. It does freeze over. So you're not going to get the same growth rate. You're paying more money. I get all that for potential for, bigger bass. And I'm not saying it is the right answer, but it's the discussion that comes up.
Is it like they can't go past the Mason-Dixon line? Are they Southerners?
No,
like, what is that like
it's
for the Florida?
It's just that they're not programmed for cold winters, so they
So
don't
what
do as well.
Because I know they stocked them in Tennessee, but that is Southern. So like, at what point is
You're
it
talking
like
pure Floridas?
Yeah, like at what point is it like, okay, this is too cold?
So it's not the best bang for your buck.
You can look at degree days. I mean, there's different ways to quantify, growing season. But it's just trial and error. They just haven't worked well. The few places we tried them, I think Germantown, I can't remember, it was before I was here, but I think Germantown might have originally gotten pure Floridas. But I think that was symptomatic sort of the general scenario where you had the potential for an 11, a 12. But more often than not, you had a lot of what appeared to be stunted. You had a huge stockpile of 9 to 13-inch fish, and it was just almost seemed impossible to alleviate that because anglers aren't going to, no matter how much you tell them, well, keep some of these small bass.
Eat 'em.
Help. They won't do it.
Yeah.
And I'm talking, catch rates of like 200 fish an hour. Just an extraordinarily high catch rate. And Germantown's still like that. I don't think the stockpile is as bad as it used to be, but that was symptomatic of a high Florida alleles, if not pure Floridas. That stockpiling and apparent poor growth or inability to sort of work through a bottleneck.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would want to do more research too, because then that's the thing. Before you do anything, you want to definitely ask the questions to the right people and research it and make sure. And obviously, forage too. I mean, obviously, you want to make sure that will withstand that. But
and I understand the data points. Like I've heard before, like, well, it's too cold. Like, what is the definition of freaking cold? Because Tennessee gets cold, North Carolina gets cold. Like, at what point is it like it is actually like this is not the best?
Because in our private setting, we're kind of like, listen to you, like it's our constituent base too. In a private setting, and it's not public water. But as we've raised money and we're going to stock it, okay, what do I want to put in? I hear like some guy, I want the crappie. I want the crappie. This guy wants trout. This guy wants smallmouth. This guy, and the smallmouth is predominant species that everybody wants. Walleye, like, they're going to be good eating. We had great growth rates in 2 years. I mean, they're pumped. They went from 5-6 inches to 17 inches, in 2 years. So
what's your forage there?
Alewives.
How many acres is Lake Holiday?
It's
I don't know if I've ever set eyes on it.
I want to say 250.
You got self-sustaining alewives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they were there forever? I mean, did somebody stop them?
That I don't know. That I don't know.
Did you tell me? I don't know if I remember that.
Crayfish population.
It's 100 feet deep at the dam, right?
Yeah, about 80 to 90 feet. It's a great, and the state does come up. Halakers come up. Reefers come up. They do about every 2 to 3 years. They'll do kind of a shock study.
You have oxygen below the thermocline in normal summer?
Mm-hmm.
That's
I
pretty
mean,
unique.
it's a great fishery.
Yeah,
I mean, at the time too, the smallmouth it was just really great, but that kind of died off.
It's not eutrophic yet.
But didn't they also have like a massive like grass kill too?
Yeah, we had the grass kill, but what we're talking about too goes into management, which I think is pretty cool. Like whether you're doing quality deer management or in this case a fishery management, and that's what you guys do too. That's what you're kind of paid to do. You're managing a fishery, and weighing like what those constituents want and what's going to be best for that that resource, that body of water. So
how much management are you guys doing of fisheries? It used to be. Well, I asked it.
John's like, that's my job.
Let me be more
Jeff,
clear.
you need to watch our first podcast.
It used to be that you would set creel limits, and that was a primary management tool, right? What are people are eating everything, so let's limit what they eat or put a size limit on it, or whatever. And that's really kind of gone, right? That strategy's gone. People are really not eating the fish like they were. It's more about
an interesting
catch rates.
concept.
So what face does management take?
So limits, harvest regulations, whether it be a bag limit or a size limit, which would include a slot limit or minimum size. Those are only typically used to restructure a fish population based on angler harvest.
Gotcha.
If you take angler harvest off the table, which in many cases it is in this day and age,
that's what I'm saying.
with almost all black bass fisheries,
right,
be they smallmouth, largemouth, whatever, and a lot of wild trout fisheries, trying to think of other primarily catch and release, then that management option is gone and is meaningless, is useless. That's one of the reasons I had disagreement with Maryland early on about wanting to put further restrictions on seasons and tournaments and whatever sizes. It just didn't make sense because we know that fishery is over 99% voluntary release. So if anything is meaningless that you try to ask the angler to do to help you change something because it's not significant.
Even limiting during spawning reproduction,
yes,
if necessary.
Because I agree, in most of the evidence in the southeast U.S. with regards to black bass, whether it's largemouth or smallmouth, would dictate that recruitment is density independent, meaning that the conditions are more driven by environmental.
There's no doubt that
if it's good,
in my mind, well, I'm going to disagree on partly because there's no doubt that the production of fish and the survival of those fish through through year one is environmental. And then it becomes an angler issue. And I know that if you pick a fish up off the nest and relocate it, it's fisher. It's young or dead. It's young or predated. So it's just a numerical issue. If we're talking about your classes, are being what constitute our fishery, and you're numerically eliminating fish one by one by removing a nesting fish, you are numerically reducing its reproduction, and you are numerically reducing that year class. It's just mathematically causing an impact to that fishery. Now, that being said, I'm not preaching about not spawning, but the reason I asked you about how much management the game department is doing, I think that we're moving into an era where the fishermen are more responsible for managing their resources, like Jake's making tackle and Lake Holiday, right? Like the people who fish the rivers need to really take the responsibility for their management. They need to know what their population of fish is, when it's time to lay off of them, when it's time not. There's Shenandoah River, when there's strong reproduction. I mean, there are so many fish in that river. It needs a little pressure during the spawn, but there's also we're coming out of a period where we had 10 years where any angler effect on the spawn could have a big impact on what was produced in that river.
So
we already had very few fish.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate to both of you because one, I think it's cultural. I think we grew up in an area where my dad was here. He kept a shotgun in the car after high school. He could go hunting. Nobody understands the outdoors here. So when you go down to like Texas Fish and Game, those people that grew up in there's a culture of the outdoors. And so you have a people that can better husbandry their resources because they know it, because the Fish and Game and then the culture they grew up in help provide that to the next generation. Up here in Loudoun County, we have people that fly in from California that have never even seen the river before, and they want to go on a float trip because they think it's amazing for their Instagram account. Those people don't understand the culture to husbandry. So I think it's a dual sword.
You're absolutely not wrong about that.
On your end, I saw what Marilyn was talking about doing the catch weight release. I would say that I don't like that as much, but then you look at Lake Fork, and that is the most micromanaged lake in the world, and that thing just pumps out kickers even when Bassmaster comes there every single year. So what is the right answer there? Because like what apparently they're doing at that lake is working, but can we simulate that in different fisheries? I don't know.
Where is Lake Fork?
Texas.
Okay.
It's I think the number one pressured lake in the world besides Lake Iowa.
Well, look at Pickwick. I mean, there's certain species also can't handle the pressure in the same way.
Pickwick,
I think smallmouth are more prone to the pressure because of their inconsistency in reproduction.
But Pickwick is catch weight release. You cannot put fish in the live well unless it's like over like an 8-pounder. And that's why Bass has to adjust it and actually do the catch weight release.
When was that instituted? Because that smallmouth fishery was destroyed between the time that I fished it with Steve Hacker, who was the original guide there in 2000.
Pickwick? What are we talking about?
Pickwick Reservoir.
Oh, Pickwick. Okay.
The tailwater to Pickwick, which was they were catching consistently 8 and 9 pound fish, smallmouth in there, unheard of large fish, and it was destroyed. It's a striper fishery now, and Steve Hacker showed me the 3 places that those fish spawn. And I said, "What's it like here in his spawn?" He says, "Well, there's 5 tournaments a day. They weigh them in at the other side of the lake, and there's 25 boats in each of the spawning areas." And so I just know numerically,
at some point
that you're going to have a major impact. And they eliminated the smallmouth in Lower Pickwick, below the dam. It's just become a striper fishery.
I would argue in Virginia at this time, excuse me, based on what we've seen, I don't think that bed fishing or seasons are needed because I don't think that the pressure is adequate enough to change the strength of a year class at the population level. On
the upper rivers, that may change. But I'll say let's stay tuned because if it does change, I mean, angler knowledge is improving. Like the Susquehanna, I believe, is an example where I do believe they're affecting the anglers are good. They know where they reproduce. It's not a secret.
Well,
there's 10
they
boats.
did. They closed that season. Yeah. They closed smallmouth.
And what happened? Boom.
But to his point,
returned.
though, to his point back, I remember because I kept thinking too. We were talking about the Shenandoah fish kill, and then the Susquehanna had the same thing. They followed the Shenandoah like 2 years later. They got slammed. And then the other thing,
slightly different issue. They were losing their young, not their
right.
But the Susquehanna also went to catch weight release.
But during that time though, that's what I'm saying though, is to his point, it wasn't the fall of that fishery because I remember going up there and it was just hammering, and then all of a sudden same thing, light switch, and it just you went through these dormant seasons. Now to your point, I like these healthy discussions because it's all different opinions and what is same type of thing. Does it go back to what's silver bullet? But I know a lot of these guys, these tournament anglers, and they've been fishing this. And these guys, some of these guys are 75, 80 years old. They've been fishing that river, since they were knee-high to grasshopper. But you're talking about pressure too. But what I've seen those years where again 20+ pound bags winning a tournament on the river, and then a slack time. But then right now, like again, it's coming right back. And those same anglers that were cussing in October because it wasn't producing on the main stem. and he's just, I mean, he's livid, right? And it's like, then that December though, I see a 5-pounder caught, I see a 4-pounder, I see a couple 3-pounders, and I'm sitting here thinking, those fish were there all along, same stretch. Those fish were there, they just weren't being caught. And so, and what's I'm learning too from just listening to you guys is, again, the environmental factors. Now, I would say, and again, I think it's going to be based on percentages, a percentage of environmental, percentage of deep hooking it, fish kill, whatever.
Yeah, it's all, there are different dials, and the dials get moved, and everything has an impact.
Kind of like Lake Holiday even right now too. Like it went into a different, when that grass went out, those fish had to go out and chase it, and those alewives are out there, and they're out now, and they're out in that 70-foot water. Now they're at 70 foot, they're at 20 foot suspended. And that's harder for people to catch. So there's, it's not, whatever. And then we had a slight fish kill up there. But right now I'm hearing really positive things. And we're seeing positive, like better fish health. They're bigger, So, I don't know. It's one of those things. And back to your points, and some can say too that catch and release was detrimental when, as far as nothing was being taken out. And that those groceries in the population, if it becomes overpopulated, well, that's going to stunt the growth too. So, I mean, the key with all this now is finding the right balance in the ecosystem, and how much do we play a role? How much is it naturally happening? I mean, that's kind of like, I think, probably the.
It comes down to just educating the public, and it's not the people that are just like me that literally reads every single tournament thing that happens every week.
Right.
It's the Joe Schmo, and I said the story like I think twice now. But when I used to go to Lake Anna with a friend, and they would just dump pesticides in the water to get the grass away back when I was a kid. They're like, oh, it's a weed, it's bad, and it's like, no, that's part of the ecosystem. You need to educate it. But it's the same thing. Like think about sharks.
It's like spraying for black
back
fly
in Jersey Shore, Ocean City, back in the 90s, killing sharks was a big deal.
Right.
And now over a 20-year educational period, like you don't even touch a shark. They think that this important thing. So if you educate the public, you can actually help the whole organization.
And what Thomas is saying, I think Jeff has done. We've done a good job where, like, again, so we're posting social media, and of course everybody likes the 5 fish. They're in the picture and it looks cool or whatever. Well, then I'm hearing this stuff and I'm thinking, well, so we're very independent from the standpoint where whether you're a weekend warrior, you're weighing 5 and having fun competing. Each to their own. But at the same time, like you're saying, the education of like, hey, and I think this is where we want to be too. During this period of time, just understand what they're doing, the fish. And if we want to make sure we have a good fishery moving forward, this is a critical time in their life cycle. So let's not hold 5 up in the thing. If you're going to catch it,
5 different pictures.
If you're going to catch it, but even get it back in the water quick and let it get back down there, protect the fry if that's what it's doing, type thing. Just try to be a good steward of the fishery and be smart about what you're doing to try to just, protect that, what we're going after, which is that fish, that smallmouth.
There's no one answer to it. We had a fish kill in the Shenandoah, and I didn't advocate for catch and release. I didn't advocate for any change in regulation because we had great reproduction, but now we don't have great reproduction. I haven't decided to advocate for catch and release period, but we may one day.
Yeah, no, that's right. We did that at Lake Holiday when we started seeing weights go down, and we weren't catching the rates and stuff, and we couldn't put a finger on it. But we were doing some tournaments and stuff, and to your point, and there was some little bit of mortality, percentage of mortality, and we're like, and we don't want to do that right now because we didn't feel like the health was there in that fishery, so we said let's pull back from that, let's not do that. Now we might come back a little later and do something like that, but I think in bass and these tournaments too, the other good thing that I appreciate, Jeremy talked about, one of our young kids, one good thing too about them, to your point, these anglers, they do care about fish care. I mean, they're serious about it. There's going to be some mortality. They've come a long way, with aeration and different things. And I think most anglers are on board with that idea. We don't want to kill.
You can see it break their heart when they hurt a fish.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, literally, people get banged up.
Yes, especially a smallmouth. To your point, like it's like, man, oh my gosh. Yeah.
John, I had one question. Circling back to something that we talked about earlier. What are the pros and cons of using grass carp versus aquatic mowers? Because you see up north in a lot of those big fisheries, they use those things. Is it something to do, like, why is it that they use it versus other places in the South don't use it? Like, could you talk about that a little bit if you have any experience with those two things?
Yeah, I've got a fair amount of experience dealing with nuisance aquatic vegetation. So you referenced the mowers, or we call it mechanical harvesting.
Mechanical harvesters, okay.
Yeah, there's basically 3 ways to deal with it. There's biological, mechanical, and chemical. Honestly, if you limited chemical treatments are a good way to go in many cases if you follow label directions. They're probably not really good for widespread use, just because we don't want to dump a ton of chemicals in our waterways, and they're very, very expensive. So probably the cheapest route to go and the easiest route, and you could say the greenest route, is the grass carp, the biological control. The problem with that is it's difficult to manipulate, and the carp don't necessarily stay where you want them. So again, every system's different. And so depending on what the primary use is of the lake or the reservoir, and what the vegetation is that's there, and what your goal is, and then you have to make a decision. Usually what they call IPM, integrated pest management, is the best way to go, and that's to use a portion biological and a portion chemical. Rarely is a mechanical harvester a good idea. I guess up north in some scenarios, maybe. I've only been involved with one mechanical harvesting operation in Virginia, and that was a long time ago on the Potomac River when the Corps of Engineers used to run a mechanical harvester to create openings for public waterways through the mats of hydrilla this was back probably 15 years ago. And honestly, it was a bit of a boondoggle, and the mechanical harvesters just spew fragments everywhere, and they kill a ton of juvenile finfish and shellfish if you're in that area. So I just don't like mechanical harvesters. They're expensive, and they have the issues I just mentioned. So I think generally, but of course, grass carp aren't going to stay in a river system. So tidal river systems are much more difficult to control nuisance aquatic vegetation in because they're flowing, obviously. And in a lake or reservoir, though, it's pretty straightforward, I think, with either biological and chemical in conjunction.
I was always curious about that because I've been following the saga that's down in Florida with the pesticide spraying and stuff, and I was always curious, well, why don't you just use a mechanical mower? That way it's not seeping in, because I guess the issue is they're over pesticiding. Now it's killing like aquatic grass that the manatees need because it's bleeding out. So it's like, why not just use like the lawnmower just to cut paths and stuff? That makes sense. But what you're saying makes a lot more sense, that it would be probably expensive as hell to.
Well,
to
none of them are permanent. All of them have a window of time that they're effective. The mechanical's the least. I mean, that's the least effective. The stuff's going to grow back within weeks, months. Chemicals, a lot of times, even in a year, you don't, depending on how hard you nuke it, you might not even have, decent treatment for the whole season. Biological is probably the more permanent if you stock enough, but then the problem is that's the hard thing about grass carp is not stocking too many, so you end up with no aquatic vegetation at all, which is a common scenario because, again, each system's different, and the productivity and the type of grass and everything, outmigration, carp mortality after stocking, all these things play a huge role. So it's so difficult to come up with a cookbook recipe to determine how many carp to stock. And typically the 2 biggest complaints are when people stock grass carp, they don't see any control, or everything's gone.
So with chemicals, it's not as, let's just say, I had no idea what I'm talking about. You don't just dump it in there and the grass will never grow there ever again. There's a lot, because I feel like a lot of people, including myself, that's what you think. You dump the chemicals in an area and you just nuke the whole area completely and grass will never grow.
Yeah, and it varies too by chemical. There's like 7 or 8 different active ingredient chemicals that are registered by EPA for aquatic use, and out of those, many are liquids, many are pellets. So depending on the type of plant you're treating, to me, a granular is much better because you control where it goes, and it will kill that plant for at least a season in that location. Typically, though, more often than not, you go with a liquid formulation that's put out through a device in a boat, and that will kill, maybe in your treatment area of concern, or maybe not, because it's much more diffuse, and so you typically have to go with a higher concentration, which costs more and potentially could have side effects. But again, most of the stuff is done at relatively lower levels. It's with experienced applicators, and they follow the label directions. It's generally safe.
Do you find it's mainly navigation, or is it like dock owners that don't want to be able to swim off their?
It's more often that from an aesthetic standpoint, lake users that just don't understand or care about the ecological value of grass.
Okay, or kayaking, because that's the thing we ran into at Lake Holiday is And I never did find. I want to know what percentage of people was it? I just want to know, was it 2 kayakers and one person wants to jump off their dock? Because I know there was a lot of vegetation up there too that they didn't even know about. That was deeper vegetation, like you were talking about before. And I get it, and I'm a huge advocate of all users, like all lake users. I'm not just selfish as a fisherman. There's gonna be people pulling tubes, and there's a whole different. So we want to be able to accommodate everybody. So my point to that too was, like, in a smaller lake, you can't do this on Lake Anna. But if it was just a dock owner, well, let's go in and let's get that out, and let's even try to put some type of barrier, like a big mat or something, to anchor it down to keep it. So if all you're wanting to do is jump off your dock and swim, let's take care of it there, but let's leave it in these other areas that and that's selective is sometimes not always easy on a big body of water. But I just asked that question because to me it should be percentage based too, almost like how many people are the squeaky wheels getting the oil, right? But if it's only
that never happens,
and what ends up happening is it's 2% or something. Next you got all these hosed up anglers that are like climbing up I always said, like, the NRA with guns, it's kind of like, don't mess with my gun. But like you were saying earlier with fishermen, we're like, man, don't mess with my smallmouth. Like, I'm gonna.
But it's also the algae blooms, like you said. Like how many algae blooms on Lake Anna may have been contributed to the lack of aquatic vegetation. Yeah. Like, I'm not saying
something's going to eat the nutrients that are available.
Yeah. Exactly.
And it's going to be algae if it's not grass. It's not a secret.
They're going somewhere.
That's right.
The
higher the phosphorus, they've graphed. Their scientists have looked at this for a million years, and the higher your phosphorus concentrations are, the more you skew towards algae from plant life, and then the higher it goes from there, the more you skew towards blue-green algae, the toxic forms of the algae. Simple math.
Interesting.
It's just a line.
We'll make that the next one.
Yeah.
Jeff, John, guy, thank you so much for coming in. Again, like and subscribe to the channel. Please hit 20. We want to try to hit 20 likes on this video. Again, we are the fastest growing fishing podcast in the greater DMV area. See you guys next time. You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your hosts, Thomas Ahrens and Jared Mounts. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked up, I don't know what will.